Boundaries. Such a loaded word, right? And what's this about beating them? Can we do that? No. I don't mean beating them like that. I mean beat them at their own game. Boundaries is just a word that I would venture to guess most of us hadn't even heard for the first 2 or 3 decades of our lives. And boy, how life may have been different if we had. I know that you're tired of attracting users and abusers into your life. If you weren't, you would probably be listening to a different podcast. But did you know that you, and only you, can stop attracting users, liars, cheats, and other general narcissists into your life? Today, we are going to talk about how, and it's easier than you think. Boundaries. Stay tuned.
Welcome to the Starting Over Stronger show, where you'll find help and hope for your divorce survival and recovery. Divorce well, live well.
Welcome back to the Starting Over Stronger show, the fastest growing divorce podcast in the world. For one reason, because people like you need what we are offering. You need to know that there's help while you're divorcing and hope for an amazing life after that. Every week we're here talking about how to find your voice and teaching you tips and tricks that most people suffered through divorce without, so that you can advocate well for yourself during your divorce. And we also mix that in with stories from survivors from all walks of life to offer you the opportunity to reflect, to release, and to reclaim the real you so you can create a life you love after your divorce. There's almost nothing that we talk about here that's more important than today's topic, and that is boundaries. Because here's the thing. If you don't know or cannot or will not articulate to others where you end and others begin, what you rightfully want and need, you will always be a magnet for people who will gladly take advantage of you. When you learn to set healthy boundaries in your life, everything changes. And that's not an exaggeration. Literally, nothing stays the same. I dare you to try it and see for yourself. But you know what else I know is that even the word boundaries itself can seem big and foreign and intimidating, let alone the act of actually beginning to set and enforce boundaries with people who may not appreciate it. So let's talk about that. The word boundaries can seem intimidating, but really it's just another way of saying self-respect. The boundaries that we set in our lives are the evidence that we respect ourselves enough to state what we need and what we want, and to insist that the people that we allow in our lives will also respect our needs and our wants, whether or not they agree with them. Actually, whether or not they even understand them. So trust me when I tell you that the people who don't respect the boundaries in your life even have boundaries. How ironic is that? They don't let you treat them in any way they don't want to be treated, do they? So why do you? Having boundaries just means knowing yourself and respecting yourself, since every boundary buster or abuser or narcissist in your life uses boundaries to their advantage to take advantage of you. I say it's time you learn to beat them at this game of life by having your own boundaries. And of course, you're going to use yours for good, not evil, right? Okay, so let's talk about the boundary busters. I call them that. I don't think I was the first one to call them that, but I don't really remember where I heard it. And you may call these people by all sorts of names other than boundary busters. User, abuser, manipulator, cheater, liar, con artist, husband, wife, control freak, narcissist. Oh, the list goes on, trust me, but you aren't really wrong to call them any of those things, but today I'm going to spend some time explaining who they are, why they love you so much, and how you can change your life forever by changing how you communicate who you are to the world. Let's start with why you're chosen, more or less, or targeted by an abuser. And the number one reason really is because you're a kind and loving person who has good values. That unfortunately makes you a target for people who abuse and mistreat. And another reason that you're chosen by someone who's considered a boundary buster is that they've tested your boundaries and they can see an opportunity to get their needs met easily. And then maybe also they have observed that you're easily controlled. And maybe you have something that they need, which in the world of narcissism, we call supply. Something that you're supplying to them is something that they feel like they need and want, and you're giving it to them easily without them having to do much in return. Another thing I want to talk about before we really get into what boundaries are is why you might struggle to have boundaries. I know a couple of different reasons that I hear often. One, maybe you feel like you don't understand why you would even need to set boundaries, because maybe we're talking about your spouse and you're thinking, why would I need to have a boundary with my spouse? What we don't realize is how easy we actually make it for our spouses to mistreat us because we don't have boundaries. Being a generous and patient person who truly loves someone, unfortunately, also means that you can be taken advantage of for your kindness if you don't also require that kindness in return. And that is a boundary. That doesn't mean don't be kind. It just means learning that boundaries actually aren't unkind. And certainly we're going to talk about that today too, about how to be firm but kind when you're setting the rules for being in a relationship with you. And that's really what boundaries are. Another issue that sometimes people say is, I grew up in a really dysfunctional family. I had a narcissistic parent, or I was in an abused situation, so it wasn't even possible for me to learn boundaries. So there's no way I'm going to be able to do that. Well, you don't have to have been raised by parents who understood, respected, and taught boundaries, though certainly that would have been nice. But honestly, I think probably most people didn't. We have to sometimes live a very long time before we learn that we have the power to stop abuse and disrespect. And that's not just at home or at work, or it's also in friendships and really everywhere. By simply voicing our thoughts and feelings and being selective more so about who and what we expose ourselves to. That's really what boundaries is. So today we're going to talk about ways to have and to hold our boundaries with the boundary busters in our life. And I jokingly started to say maybe this is to have and to hold that we should have vowed from the beginning. Have and hold boundaries. Okay, so start here. Let's just keep it simple. A boundary is you just stating what you need and want in any given situation. Whatever's going on, whatever the subject at hand is, you're just speaking honestly from your heart and your mind, matter-of-factly, about what you need or what you want. Now, to further expand on this simple rule, you really want to state your needs and your wants in a manner that it can best be heard. And there's an attorney named Bill Eddy who's written a book on this subject, and he calls it BIFF, B-I-F-F. And, you may find it interesting. What does an attorney have to teach us about boundaries? Well, when he's worked in family law for decades, you can imagine he's learned a thing or two about what works when communicating with difficult people. So he's actually an excellent source on this subject. And BIFF stands for brief, informative, friendly, and firm. And so just think about that. Whenever you're stating a boundary, you want to be brief. You don't need to explain it at length to somebody. You want to be informative. You don't want to have it be really an emotional plea. It should be a factual statement. And then you want to be friendly. And sometimes, obviously, that's the hardest one right there, because if you're having to state a boundary, you're probably in the middle of a conflict and voices may be raised or people may be on guard or defensive with their words. But really, your message will be better heard when you are at least polite. And friendly really is intended purposefully to go a little bit beyond polite, even to be kind, to say please and thank you. And then firm just is basically to imply that this isn't a negotiation. I'm not sharing my boundary in order to have a conversation with you about whether or not I should have it. I'm firm on this. This is what's happening. This is how I feel, and this is what I expect in this situation. And so that kind of leads to the second point when it comes to setting boundaries, and that is don't justify, explain, or defend yourself. Just state the facts. You do not need to rationalize, explain, or get someone's agreement about your boundaries. They're your boundaries. And in fact, anybody that would challenge your boundaries is never going to be agreeable to them anyway, no matter how much you rationalize and explain and try to justify or defend. So you really need to just state them. And people who respect other people's boundaries won't test you. They often don't need you to explain. And even in the cases when maybe an explanation is necessary, they know how to have a respectful adult conversation with you about that without putting you on the defense. So you can probably rest assured that if you're feeling defensive, you're dealing with a boundary buster. And that means you're dealing with somebody who, no matter how much you try to explain things, still isn't going to agree with you because they don't like what you're saying. So just state it and walk away if need be. And then that leads us to the next point, which is to leave conversations when they feel unhealthy. This is really one of probably the most common boundaries when it comes to dealing with a boundary buster, and that is the decision of when to leave a conversation. And that's going to be different for everybody. And most people who struggle with boundaries tolerate way too much disrespect in a conversation before they end it, if they ever do. So I will just say, most likely you need to be really thinking about how you're going to handle that well in advance of the difficult conversations, because you're going to need to probably push yourself in the direction of really being more firm with that and not exposing yourself to more than you should, more than is healthy for you to tolerate. So, and then, that actually kind of leads to the next point, which is deciding what you will tolerate and what you will not tolerate. And then the hard part is sticking to that. You do have to decide, when you set boundaries, you'll have to decide what for you is negotiable and what's non-negotiable. Obviously, some boundaries are more important than others. So identify what you're willing to accept in your relationship and what you consider absolutely intolerable or non-negotiable. Maybe you need to spend some time in your journal and really make a list of those things. You know your relationship better than anyone. Look at the things that happen on a regular basis in your relationship and decide what's tolerable but uncomfortable and what is unacceptable. And then if you're willing to compromise on some things, compromise can be a good thing, especially if both people are adjusting and maybe both people are actually trying to improve things in the relationship. Compromise can be a very good thing as a temporary measure, especially to move toward positive change together. However, you have to keep in mind that true compromise isn't abandoning your needs in order to please someone else or to keep the peace or accepting treatment that you consider a deal breaker. if you've decided something is intolerable and someone repeatedly violates that most important boundary to you, you have to ask yourself how long you're going to be willing to accept such treatment. And obviously, I've seen people accept disrespect and abuse for years and years. I was one of them, hoping that the toxic people in my life would be willing to change and see how they were hurting me, and only to look back in hindsight to see that those people had never had any intention of changing or respecting my boundaries. They were just trying to get me to acquiesce to theirs, right? So that's a really hard one, but very, very important one. And another one is to learn the art of sidestepping questions and complaints from boundary busters. So in other words, what are the levels of engagement that you're going to pursue with this person? And so if they say something that you feel like is going to go in a totally different direction and escalate, how can you get around that question or complaint smoothly to avoid that? And, obviously that's going to look different for everybody in every situation, but that's something to be thinking about, is how can I gracefully sidestep that question and complaint and get back to the matter at hand or what have you. And then, honestly, one of the real hard parts of boundaries is the fact that they're going to get ignored sometimes. They're going to get squashed. So you're going to have to be willing to call the fouls. When you express a boundary and it is violated, you need to let the boundary buster know that they have disregarded your stated need or desire, and that there will be consequences, and what those consequences will be. There needs to be consequences. Otherwise, you're wasting your time saying there's a boundary. Because if there's not a consequence, then there's not really a boundary. And you will really quickly make things even worse than they already are if you start saying you're going to have boundaries and not enforcing them. So you need to decide, what are my boundaries going to be? And start small. Pick one or two things that are like the major issues in this relationship, and work really hard on getting firm on those one or two boundaries and the consequences on those. And then maybe you discover that there's more that you can do, but you'll have that under your belt and you'll feel more confidence about the others in the future. But if you try to change 10 things at one time, not only is your boundary buster going to struggle with it, which of course they're going to, but you are as well, because you're going to be feeling like you're being nailed from every angle, So just pick a few things at first. And then, like I said, there needs to be consequences. I do realize it sounds like we're talking about dealing with toddlers here, but the fact is we kind of are. Adults who don't respect the stated boundaries of other adults kind of are like children, and they should be treated like children. And so state it clearly, slowly. You don't have to be mean. You don't have to be condescending or sarcastic. And really, you shouldn't be. Remember, we said before, you need to be brief, informative, friendly, and firm. But if you're getting the response of a toddler, then just like a toddler, you're probably going to have to say it again and again and again and again. And you're going to have to say it slower. And maybe you're going to have to say it the exact same way. Maybe you're going to have to say it different ways. But you're going to have to make it very clear and plain and simple. And one thing you can do that would help when you're new at setting boundaries is to write down what's happening. Record the boundary violations and your responses. Now, what this will do is not only give you a record of what's been going on, but it will help you to process it. So you can kind of check yourself for, where are you weak in your boundaries? Where are you saying that you're going to do something and then you're not following through with it? And it is hard to repeatedly set the same boundary with someone over and over and over again who isn't listening and doesn't care. And so often we do start to give up or become inconsistent with our boundaries. And when we do that, you give, what's the saying? If you give them an inch, they become a ruler. So if you notice that you aren't consistently setting healthy boundaries, you'll want to make adjustments. And if you're recording everything, then you're going to be a lot more effective at making those adjustments. If you're being consistent with things, writing down things can actually help you get clarity about what you're willing to accept and how you feel about it as you begin to see patterns emerge in your journaling. So that's a very important part of it. You knew I wouldn't get through an episode without talking about journaling, right? Now, never underestimate the depths to which a boundary buster will sink to undermine your stated boundaries. Sometimes they have no problem whatsoever acting like, we said, a child. They will do whatever they have to do to try to get you to relax your boundary or to prove that you didn't really mean it. And it can sometimes get very childish. So don't be surprised if it goes that direction. And on that note, don't underestimate how utterly exhausting it will be to set and hold boundaries with an emotional toddler. It's not fun. You have to be willing to enforce, and that means be willing to hold those consequences. So, for example, if you say to your partner, when you escalate an argument to yelling, I will be leaving the house. You will have to leave the house each and every time he or she escalates to yelling. Or guess what? They will continue to escalate to yelling because they know you don't mean what you say. And that's a hard pill to swallow, but we have to mean what we say when we state a boundary. So those are the quick ways to really think about boundaries and to begin to set and learn and enforce boundaries. Are you getting the support you need as you divorce or face the possibility of divorce? Did you know that for just $55 a month, you can be a part of a 1-hour weekly support group call of people just like you? Some haven't even filed yet, but they know the marriage is not sustainable or healthy. Some were served papers they didn't want. Others are feeling empowered that they finally took the reins of their life and hired an attorney and a divorce coach to help them navigate the uncertain waters of divorce. All of them are facing fear, grief, loss, confusion, and pain, and they're finding help and hope in a Starting Over Stronger support group. You can get registered today for a group at startingoverstronger.com/groups and start this week in getting the help you need to divorce well and then live well. Remember, divorce is hard. Life after doesn't have to be, but the support you get now is what makes the difference. Let's talk for just a minute about why. Why do we need to have good boundaries? We know what they are. We know now how to set them. And let's talk a little bit about why, the reasons why we have to learn better boundaries. I would say the number one reason is because boundaries set limits with those that are abusing you or that might abuse you. And so it becomes easier to identify who's doing that. If you set boundaries for your life, then you become aware of who's pushing those boundaries, who's respecting them. And then it becomes very clear what you need to do and what relationships you need to reevaluate in your life. It also helps you to protect yourself, obviously, emotionally, but even your assets, your heart, your time, your mental health. You cannot protect yourself if you have no boundaries, because what that means is that you just let anybody that you have any connection with whatsoever treat you in whatever way they want to and get away with it. And that is a very unprotected place to be in. And another reason why we have to learn better boundaries is because it will empower us to set and communicate the rules that we want to have in our relationships. You know, if you think about it, it's easy to complain about our relationships with our boss, with our coworkers, with our friends, with our spouse, with our parents or siblings or neighbors or whoever, you can complain all day about the relationships that you have in your life, but the truth is that you're the one that sets and communicates the rules of engagement for your life. So if you're being mistreated in any of those places in your life, it's because you're allowing people to mistreat you. And that can be kind of a hard one to swallow, right? I mean, we want to not re-victimize you here. I'm not trying to say that you're responsible for your abuse, because certainly you are not. But truly, only you can change that dynamic, because your abusers and the people who mistreat you have no incentive to change. They're fine with things the way they are, right? So you have to learn to set boundaries so that you can empower yourself to be very clear about what you want in your life. And by doing so, you're going to relieve incredible amounts of anxiety and confusion, depression, and pain. Because when the people that you allow in your life know how they're expected to treat you, guess what? They behave. Or you have to set consequences, and those consequences look like additional boundaries that involve detachment and distance, right? So the more you do those things, the more peace you will have in your life. So, and that's another reason why, is because you want to create a more peaceful life. You want to have less anger, less resentment in your life. And you may be in a place right now in your life where you cannot even imagine having a peaceful life. And I was there once too, so I get it. But I got to tell you, I don't know if I even believed it was a possibility. At one point in my life, I thought this is just how life is. But it's not. When you have boundaries, you are better able to find the things and the people that you enjoy that actually make you happy and bring you joy in your mind and your heart and your spirit. And the more that you surround yourself with only those people, you wouldn't believe what an amazing peace you can have in your life. To not wake up every day and wonder what arguments you're going to have and what disrespect is going to be shown to you that day. And then the more that you create that kind of a life for yourself, the more you're actually going to experience compassion for yourself. Because, you know, we all have that inner child inside of us that is the real us, you know, before life got in the way and made us cynical and wounded, right? And your inner child is going to finally be happy and loving you, and you're loving yourself. And it's just a totally different space to occupy. I don't know how to explain it. It sounds really flowery, I'm sure. But here's the most important thing I can tell you today. As you learn to understand, to set, and to hold boundaries in your life, the unfortunate thing that you are going to learn is that you will have to accept that some people are not going to respect your boundaries, no matter what you do. This can be a really hard truth to swallow, because we want to believe that people are good, right? We want to be able to believe that, because we'd like to be able to convince people to respect our boundaries because we would do that for them. And it's incredibly disappointing to realize that you are in a relationship with someone who doesn't love you the way that you love them. And that you have to actually maybe decide whether you want to continue to have a relationship with this person. Because, you know, the boundary setting process is actually kind of the litmus test for whether or not a relationship is willing to change. And by a relationship, I mean both parties in the relationship are equally invested in positive change. And we won't really know that in a relationship until one or the other parties begin to set and hold boundaries. And if and when that happens, and the other parties are able to adjust to that and to begin to make positive changes together, then we know that we can change and things can grow and improve. But when we set boundaries and that other person continues to disrespect them no matter what we do, we then have a choice to make. We have to recognize we cannot change someone else's behavior. We can only choose to accept it or to disengage from it. So the boundary setting process is really where we find out whether or not our relationship can be improved or saved. And so let's talk for just a minute about how to handle it when that's not the direction that it goes. Because again, we're talking today about beating the boundary busters in your life. And there's just only so much you can do when you've got someone who refuses to respect your boundaries. And the first thing to do is to practice loving detachment. Detaching is simply shifting away from trying to control people, trying to control situations. We all have situations where we're in a state of fear. And so it's obviously understandable that you're going to want to try to control things. You're going to want to try to protect yourself, but you can't control other people. And so really detachment is when we accept that we can't change other people. When we stop trying to. When we stop trying to force the outcome that we want in a given situation. That's detachment. And sometimes that looks like, we talked about earlier, physically leaving a situation that's become escalated, uncomfortable, or even dangerous. Sometimes it's responding in a different way, but not leaving. For example, instead of taking something personally and responding back defensively, maybe we shrug off some rude comment or whatever that's, maybe that changes the dynamics of the interaction enough that we can get some power back in that situation. Maybe detachment looks like declining an invitation to spend time with someone. You have a choice about how you spend your time. Maybe you just don't spend as much of it with that person. And maybe that in and of itself then becomes sort of a wake-up call to that person. And maybe they actually want to change after they realize that their behavior causes you to not want to be with them. Maybe not, but it's going to protect you either way. And the main thing is you have to let them make their own decisions and deal with the consequences of those decisions. If they're going to continue to disrespect you and disregard your stated boundaries, then that's what they're going to do. So now what are the consequences going to be for that? And are you going to let them sit in those consequences, even if it makes them sad? And then they want you to make them feel better because now they're sad because of your boundaries and consequences. That's not your job. You've got to let them make their own decisions and deal with the consequences of those. And that's not being mean. That's realistic. Personal responsibility goes both ways. One important thing to consider is that if you've got someone who's not respecting your boundaries, don't give them advice. They aren't going to listen to it anyway, right? Stop giving them unsolicited advice and choose to stop participating in the same old patterns and arguments that happen over and over again, or remove yourself from a conversation or an argument. Maybe it goes beyond that even. Maybe you move out. Maybe you move to a different room. Maybe, there's just so many different ways this can look, but the idea is that if they are not respecting your boundaries, then things should start to change in ways that make you more comfortable, and not intentionally, but it is going to make them less comfortable. And the thing to remember is that detaching does not mean you don't care about this person. It actually just means that you're taking care of yourself. And that's what you're supposed to do. You're being realistic about what you can do in any given situation. And you're allowing them to have the responsibility that they should have for themselves and for their actions. And that's actually a very caring thing to do, even though they won't see it that way. But you have to remember that your time is your greatest asset. So if you have someone who you have tried to set boundaries with to improve the relationship and it continues to be disregarded, the only change that can happen is for you to limit contact or maybe even go no contact. And sometimes that's the only way that you can protect yourself from a toxic person is just to remove yourself from that situation. And you probably can't even begin to imagine if you're in the middle of it right now, how amazing it's going to feel to have limited or no contact with that person. It's incredibly empowering. It's amazingly freeing to no longer live under that dark cloud. And you have to maintain the proper attitude about it too, though, because it is not intended to punish them. And it's not manipulation. You don't go no contact or leave a situation to produce a certain result in that person or to punish them or manipulate them into doing what you want them to do. You're doing it to take care of yourself. And certainly if someone's hurting you physically or emotionally, you owe it to yourself to put some distance between you and them. No matter what anyone tells you, you do not have to have a relationship with anyone who makes you feel bad about yourself. I don't care if they're blood, and I don't care if you're married to them, and I don't care if you gave birth to them. No one has the right to treat you badly or make you feel bad about yourself. And no matter what anyone tells you, you do not have to tolerate that. Family and friends should lift us up. They should support us. They should love us. We should leave their presence feeling better than we did before. Not more depressed, not anxious, angry, confused, or in pain. So no matter what anyone tells you, you have to take care of you and only you. Now, if you have minor children, obviously you have to take care of your minor children, but you know what I'm talking about here. You have to take care of you first and foremost because you can't take care of any little ones unless you are taking care of you and unless you are preventing yourself from being mistreated. And no, none of this will be easy, but it will get easier over time and it will be very much worth it in the end. You will be so much happier, so much healthier. And it's just an amazing feeling to know that you beat the boundary buster at their own game. They were putting their own needs ahead of yours the whole time. And now, guess what? You're doing that. You're taking care of you and you're not feeling guilty about it. And here's the thing. You have choices. You always have choices. Honestly, the only time you feel like you don't have choices is when you tell yourself that you don't have choices. That's how powerful your mind is. You have to change your mind if you want to change your life. And I know it sounds so simplistic, but it's also true. One of the great things about being an adult is that we have choices. Remember when you were a kid and maybe you were mistreated at home or you just had a bad day and didn't get the support you needed at home or whatever. Do you remember how stuck that felt? Because what are you going to do? You can't go anywhere. These people provide your food, your shelter, your way to school. You know, you're not going anywhere. As an adult, you have choices. You do not have to continue to be friends with someone who takes advantage of your kindness. You do not have to continue to work for someone who criticizes you or belittles you nonstop. There is no job under the sun that is worth that. And you do not have to stay in a romantic relationship or a marriage with someone who mistreats you, abuses you, disrespects your boundaries, gaslights you, or tries to control your every move and thought. You have choices. Now, sometimes we don't like our choices, but we have choices. When I left my marriage, I had no idea what plan B was. I just knew plan A was no longer an option. And I jokingly said many times, I don't care if I eat beans and weenies the rest of my life, I will not live like this any longer. But the thing is, you have to get to that point where it doesn't matter what plan B is, because plan A is no longer an option. I will not be treated like this. I am not trapped. I am not powerless. I do know how to advocate for myself. And furthermore, when I don't know how to, I know how to get the help I need so that I can. And yes, of course, choosing to end relationships, even the abusive ones, is incredibly painful. You still love that person. And maybe for practical reasons, it feels impossible to end the relationship, financially or whatever other reason. You know, you can look now for a new job, or you can stay with a friend or, you know, whatever you need to do, you can figure out solutions. You do not have to stay stuck. But remember that when we're truly honest with ourselves, a lot of times what's underneath all of that excuse making, oh, I can't do that because of this and this and this, even though some of that might be true. What we're really just not willing to say to ourselves at that point is that we're not willing to end the relationship, even though we know it's killing us inside, because we're still in love, because we're good people who believe that everyone can change and everyone deserves second chances, third chances, 500 chances. You know, we just have such a good heart and we want things to be better. We want to have good relationships with people. Ultimately, you have choices. That's the point I want to make. You can sit down with your journal and identify your choices. Detach emotionally, detach physically, limit contact, avoid being alone with that person, practice self-care, set boundaries, set consequences, whatever that's going to look like for you. At least identify what all your choices are. And then in any given situation, just choose what is the best option here. Above all, respect yourself and trust your instincts. I hope you've learned a lot today about boundaries, and I hope that you plan to make some measurable changes as a result. Let's start with just one thing. What is the biggest pain in your life right now that you would like to set a boundary around? What hurts the most? And then what will the boundary be? And what will the consequence be for violating the boundary? Okay. 3 things. Grab your journal and start making some plans for change. What is the worst pain in my life right now that I want to set a boundary around? What is the boundary going to be? And what will the consequence be for violating it? You've got this, my friend. I know you can do it. I'll see you again next week for more help as you divorce and hope as you are starting over stronger.